The rain fell in sheets, relentless and cold, as if the heavens themselves had declared war on the cobblestone streets of Millbrook. It was the kind of October storm that turned day into twilight and made even the hardiest souls seek shelter. But Lenora Ashby had no shelter left to seek. She stood on the narrow porch of Mrs. Grimsby's boarding house, her single leather valise clutched against her chest like a shield, watching the water cascade from the eaves in silvery ribbons. Behind her, the door had already closed, locked, bolted, final. The sound of that latch sliding into place still echoed in her ears, more deafening somehow than the thunder rolling across the valley. 3 weeks, Mrs. Grimsby had said, her thin lips pressed together in a line of practiced indifference. "You're 3 weeks behind, Miss Ashby. I run a respectable establishment, not a charitable institution." Lenora had tried to explain about the factory closing, about the promised position at the millinery that had fallen through when the owner discovered she was unmarried and living alone, about the illness that had kept her bedridden for 5 precious days when she should have been searching for work. But Mrs. Grimsby's eyes had remained as cold and gray as the storm clouds gathering outside her parlor window. "Your things will be on the porch within the hour. I suggest you make arrangements." There had been no arrangements to make. No family to wire for money. Her parents had been in the ground for 6 years now, victims of the influenza that had swept through their small farming community. No friends with spare rooms. The few acquaintances she'd made in Millbrook were fellow boarders, women as precarious in their circumstances as she was in hers. No savings tucked away for emergencies. Every cent she'd earned at the textile factory had gone to rent, food, and the modest black dress she wore now, purchased when she'd still believed that looking respectable might open doors. Those doors, it seemed, only opened to close again. Lenora took a deep breath, tasting rain and smoke and the metallic tang of desperation. She was 26 years old. She had survived scarlet fever at 8, her mother's death at 19, her father's a year later. She had traveled alone from a dying farm in Nebraska to this industrial town in Pennsylvania, had learned to operate machinery that could take a finger in an instant of inattention, had navigated the treacherous waters of being a woman alone in a world that viewed such women with suspicion at best and contempt at worst. She would survive this too. But first, she needed to move. The rain was already soaking through her thin wool coat as she stepped off the porch and into the deluge. Her boots, resoled twice and beginning to separate at the seams, squelched in the mud that had replaced the dusty road. She had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left, though the storm made it difficult to tell. 2 hours to find somewhere, anywhere, to spend the night without freezing to death or being arrested for vagrancy. The town of Millbrook spread before her like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, its colors bleeding and running together. The main street, with its brick storefronts and striped awnings, was nearly deserted. A few hardy souls hurried past with umbrellas or newspapers held over their heads, but no one spared a glance for the bedraggled woman walking purposefully toward... Toward what, exactly? Lenora's mind raced through possibilities and discarded them just as quickly. The church on Maple Street sometimes offered shelter to the destitute, but Reverend Morrison had made it clear last Sunday that such charity was reserved for women of unimpeachable character, a category that apparently did not include those who worked in factories and lived in boarding houses. The train station would be warm and dry, but the station master knew her face and would ask questions she couldn't answer. The livery stable? No. She'd heard stories about women who sought shelter in such places, stories that ended in ways she refused to contemplate.
She was so lost in her desperate calculations that she didn't see the child until she nearly trampled her. "Oh!" Lenora stumbled backward, her valise slipping from her rain-slicked fingers and landing in a puddle with a splash that soaked them both. "I'm so sorry, I didn't." The child, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, with tangled dark hair plastered to her pale face, stared up at her with enormous brown eyes.
She wore a dress that had once been blue but was now a muddy gray, and she was crying, though the tears were nearly invisible among the raindrops streaming down her cheeks. "I can't find him," the girl said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I can't find my brother, and Papa said to stay together, but he ran off, and now I can't find him, and Papa's going to be so angry." "Slow down, sweetheart." Lenora crouched to the child's level, heedless of the water soaking through her skirt. "What's your name?" "Iris. Iris Callahan." "All right, Iris. I'm Lenora. Can you tell me what your brother looks like?" The girl sniffled, wiping her nose with a soaked sleeve. "He's 5. He has brown hair like mine, and he's wearing a red coat. Mama's red coat that Papa made small for him. And his name is Theodore, but we call him Teddy, and he's scared of thunder and—" A crack of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a boom of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Iris shrieked and threw herself against Lenora, her small arms wrapping around Lenora's neck with desperate strength. "It's all right," Lenora said automatically, even as her own heart raced. "It's just noise. It can't hurt you. But we need to find your brother. Where did you last see him?" "By the general store. Papa sent us to get flour while he was at the blacksmith's, but Teddy saw a dog and he ran after it, and I tried to follow, but he's faster than me and—" "The general store. That's on the corner of Main and Oak, yes?" Lenora was already standing, pulling the child up with her. "Come on, we'll retrace your steps. A little boy in a red coat shouldn't be too hard to spot." She didn't think about her valise, still lying in the puddle behind her. She didn't think about the cold seeping into her bones, or the darkness creeping in at the edges of the sky. There was a child lost in this storm, a child who was afraid of thunder, and that was the only thing that mattered. They searched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Lenora called out, "Teddy!" until her voice was hoarse, while Iris clung to her hand with a grip that would likely leave bruises. They checked behind barrels and under porches, in the narrow alleys between buildings and beneath the wheels of abandoned carts. The rain showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, driven by a wind that cut through Lenora's wet clothing like a knife. She was beginning to fear the worst: the river that ran behind the town, swollen with autumn rains, the horses that might spook at thunder, the strangers who might take advantage of a small boy alone when she heard it. A dog barking. And beneath it, barely audible, a child's laugh. "This way!" She pulled Iris toward the sound, around the corner of the hardware store and into a narrow alley that dead-ended at a wooden fence. And there, huddled under an overturned wheelbarrow with a scruffy brown mutt, was a small boy in a red coat. "Teddy!" Iris released Lenora's hand and threw herself at her brother, nearly knocking him over in her enthusiasm. "You scared me! You scared me so much! Papa's going to be so angry!" The boy's lower lip trembled. "I just wanted to pet the dog. He was all alone and scared, like me." Lenora knelt beside them, her relief so profound it made her dizzy. "You're both safe now. That's what matters. But Iris is right. You shouldn't have run off."
Your papa must be worried sick." "Papa?"
Iris's face went pale. "He'll be looking for us. We were supposed to meet him at the blacksmith's ages ago." "Then we'd better get you there." Lenora stood, offering her hands to both children. "Can you show me the way?" The blacksmith's shop was only 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles through the driving rain. By the time they reached it, Lenora could no longer feel her feet, and her teeth were chattering so violently she could barely speak. The children, at least, seemed to have warmed up with the excitement of reunion, chattering to each other about the dog, whose name Teddy had decided was Captain, and whether Papa would be more relieved or furious. The answer, it turned out, was both. The door to the blacksmith's shop burst open before they reached it, and a man emerged into the rain with the wild-eyed look of a parent who has imagined every possible catastrophe. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that might have been neat once, but was now plastered to his forehead, and a face that was handsome in a rough-hewn way, smart jaw, straight nose, deep-set eyes that were currently blazing with a mixture of terror and relief. "Iris!" "Theodore." He swept both children into his arms, lifting them off their feet as if they weighed nothing. "Where have you been?" "I've been searching for half an hour. I was about to call for the sheriff."
"Teddy ran after a dog,"
Iris said, her voice muffled against her father's shoulder.
"and I tried to find him, but I couldn't, and then this lady helped me."
The man's eyes found Lenora for the first time. She was suddenly acutely aware of how she must look, soaked to the skin, her hair escaping its pins in bedraggled tendrils, her dress muddy and clinging, her lips probably blue with cold. She looked like a drowned rat. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman with nothing and no one, standing in the rain because she had nowhere else to go. "You found them?" His voice was hoarse.
"They found each other, really. I just helped with the looking."
He set the children down, but kept his hands on their shoulders as if afraid they might disappear again if he let go. "I don't know how to thank you. If anything had happened to them—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "They're all I have left." Something in his voice made Lenora's chest ache. She recognized that tone, the sound of someone who had lost too much and was terrified of losing more. "I'm glad I could help," she said. "You should get them inside, out of this rain. They'll catch their death." "So will you, by the look of it." His eyes narrowed, taking in her appearance more carefully now. "Where's your umbrella? Your coat looks barely fit for autumn, let alone a storm like this." "I'll be fine." The lie came automatically. "I should be going." "Going where?" The question was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. Lenora opened her mouth to answer and found she had nothing to say. No address to give, no destination to name, just the rain and the cold and the growing darkness. The man's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes. He glanced at the children, then back at her, and seemed to come to some decision. "I'm Samuel Callahan," he said. "I have a farm about 2 miles outside of town. There's a spare room. It was my mother's before she passed. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "You look like you could use warm and dry." Lenora stared at him. A stranger. A man she'd known for all of 5 minutes, offering her shelter with no conditions, no questions about why she was standing in the rain with everything she owned in a valise she'd left lying in a puddle 3 blocks away. "I couldn't possibly." "You saved my children." His jaw tightened. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." I won't pretend to know your circumstances, and I won't ask. But I have a room, and you need one. It's that simple." It wasn't simple at all. Nothing about this was simple. But Lenora was cold and tired and out of options, and this man was looking at her not with pity or suspicion, but with something that might have been respect. "I can work," she heard herself say. "I can cook and clean and help with the children. I won't be a burden." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval. "We can discuss arrangements later. Right now, I need to get these two home before they catch pneumonia." He whistled sharply, and a moment later a horse and wagon appeared from behind the blacksmith shop, driven by an elderly man who looked thoroughly disgruntled at being out in such weather. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," Samuel called. "I'll return the wagon tomorrow." "See that you do," the old man grumbled, climbing down and hurrying back into the warmth of the shop. Samuel lifted both children into the wagon bed, then turned to Lenora. "Miss Ashby, Lenora Ashby." "Miss Ashby." He offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. "Welcome to chaos." As the wagon lurched into motion, carrying her away from Millbrook and toward an uncertain future, Lenora couldn't help but glance back at the town that had rejected her. The rain was already washing away her footprints, erasing any evidence that she'd ever been there at all. But ahead, through the gray curtain of the storm, she could just make out the shape of hills and trees and, somewhere beyond them, a farmhouse with a spare room and two children who had already fallen asleep against each other in the wagon bed. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she could trust this quiet, grieving man, or what demons he might be hiding behind those watchful eyes. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone in the rain. And for now, that would have to be enough. What Lenora didn't see as the wagon rounded the bend and the town disappeared behind them was the figure standing in the doorway of the general store, watching them go. A woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had recognized the Callahan wagon and was already composing the gossip she would spread by morning about the widower who had taken in a strange woman. A woman with no reputation and no references. A woman who had appeared from nowhere in the middle of a storm. By sunrise, the whole town would be talking. And some of them would be asking questions that Lenora Ashby had spent 3 years running from. Questions about a dead man in St. Louis, and the fire that was supposed to have buried the truth forever. The Callahan farmhouse emerged from the darkness like a ship appearing through fog. First, the warm glow of a single lamp in a downstairs window. Then the solid shape of weathered clapboard and a sagging front porch. The rain had gentled to a persistent drizzle by the time Silas pulled the wagon around to the side of the house. But Lenora was soaked through to her bones, her teeth chattering despite her best efforts to control them. "Stay here a moment," Silas said, setting the brake and climbing down from the seat. "I'll get the children inside first." Lenora nodded, watching as he lifted Rosie, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder during the drive, and carried her toward the house. The boy, Ezra, followed silently, casting one last suspicious glance back at Lenora before disappearing through the kitchen door. Alone in the darkness, Lenora allowed herself a single moment of weakness. She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her heart beneath her rain-soaked dress. What am I doing? The question echoed through her mind with increasing urgency. What kind of fool accepts shelter from a stranger in the middle of nowhere? But the alternative was the storm, the streets, the slow death of exposure,
or the faster death of desperation. She had survived worse than a suspicious 12-year-old boy and a farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. The kitchen door opened again, spilling lamplight across the muddy yard. Silas stood silhouetted in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. "Miss Ashby."
"You can come in now." Lenora gathered her valise and climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff and unsteady. The ground squelched beneath her boots as she crossed to the house, and she was acutely aware of the trail of water and mud she would leave on his floors. "I'm sorry," she said as she stepped over the threshold. "I'll clean." "Don't." The word was gentle but firm. "You'll catch your death if you don't get warm and dry. There's a room at the top of the stairs, second door on the left. It was—" He paused, something flickering across his weathered face. "It's been empty for a while. There should be blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed, and I'll bring up some hot water for washing." Lenora stood dripping on his kitchen floor, taking in the details of the room with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read houses the way others read books. The kitchen was clean but not tidy. Dishes stacked in the dry sink waiting to be washed. A basket of mending abandoned on a chair. Children's drawings tacked to the wall beside the stove. A woman's apron still hung on a hook by the door, faded blue cotton with embroidered daisies along the hem. The ghost of Mrs. Callahan was everywhere and nowhere. "Mr. Callahan, Silas?" He was already pumping water into a kettle, his movements efficient and automatic. "No one's called me Mr. Callahan since my father died." "Silas, then." The name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for a man she'd known less than an hour. "I want you to know that I'm grateful, truly grateful. But I also want you to know that I won't be a burden. I can work. I can cook and clean and mend, and I'm not afraid of hard labor. Whatever you need done around this place, I can." "Miss Ashby?" He turned to face her, and in the lamplight she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples. He couldn't have been more than 35, but grief had aged him. "It's late. We're both tired. Whatever arrangements need to be made, we can discuss them in the morning. For now, just—" He gestured vaguely toward the stairs. "Rest, please." There was something in his voice, not quite pleading, but close to it, that made Lenora swallow the rest of her protests. She nodded once, clutching her valise to her chest, and made her way toward the narrow staircase at the back of the kitchen. The second door on the left opened onto a small room with a sloped ceiling and a single window that looked out over the rain-dark fields. The bed was narrow but sturdy, covered with a faded quilt in shades of blue and cream. A washstand stood in the corner, and a small writing desk had been pushed against the wall beneath the window. It was, Lenora realized with a start, a woman's room. Not a guest room hastily prepared, but a space that had been lived in, loved in. The wallpaper, pale yellow with tiny sprigs of lavender, had been chosen with care. A sampler hung above the bed, cross-stitched with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She was standing in a dead woman's bedroom. Lenora set her valise down slowly, her fingers trembling. She should feel something, guilt perhaps, or unease at occupying a space still heavy with another woman's memory. Instead, she felt only a bone-deep weariness and a strange, unexpected sense of safety. "No one will think to look for you here." The thought rose unbidden, and she pushed it away with practiced determination. She had become skilled at not thinking, at keeping certain doors in her mind firmly locked and bolted. The past was a country she had fled, and she would not be dragged back across its borders by her own treacherous thoughts. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Ashby?" Silas's voice muffled through the wood. "I've brought the water." She opened the door to find him standing in the narrow hallway, a steaming kettle in one hand and a bundle of cloth in the other. He didn't cross the threshold, she noticed, kept himself carefully on the other side of the doorway. "The pitcher on the washstand should be empty," he said, handing her the kettle. "And these." He held out the bundle. "They're old, but they're clean and dry. I thought you might want something to sleep in." Lenora accepted both, her fingers brushing against his calloused palm as she took the clothes. The touch was brief, impersonal, but it sent an unexpected shock through her, the simple human contact after so many months of careful isolation. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything." "I don't know how I'll ever get some sleep, Miss Ashby." He was already turning away, his broad back disappearing down the dark hallway. "Morning comes early on a farm." She closed the door and leaned against it, listening to his heavy footsteps descending the stairs. Only when she heard the distant creak of a door closing somewhere below did she allow herself to move, to pour the hot water into the basin and begin the slow process of peeling off her sodden clothes. The bundle Silas had given her contained a nightgown, plain white cotton, worn soft with age, and a thick woolen shawl. Both smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something floral that made Lenora's throat tighten. These had belonged to his wife. He had kept them all this time preserved in some chest or closet, and now he was giving them to a stranger. She didn't know whether to be touched by his generosity or disturbed by what it might mean about a man still so clearly haunted by his loss. "Don't think about it," she told herself firmly. "Don't think about anything except getting through tonight and tomorrow and the day after that." She washed quickly, the warm water a blessing against her chilled skin, and pulled the nightgown over her head. It was too short, the hem barely reaching her calves, but it was dry and warm, and that was all that mattered. The bed creaked as she climbed beneath the covers, the mattress dipping slightly in the middle where countless nights of sleep had worn it down. Lenora stared up at the shadowed ceiling, listening to the rain tap against the window and the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere below, a floorboard groaned. A door opened and closed. She heard the low murmur of Silas's voice, too distant to make out the words, and then silence. "He's checking on the children," she thought, "making sure Rosie is warm, making sure Ezra isn't still awake and worrying." It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary act of fatherly devotion, but it made something ache deep in Lenora's chest. She had no memories of her own father. He had died before she was old enough to remember his face, and her mother had followed him into the grave when Lenora was barely 12. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself. "Don't," she warned herself again, "don't start wanting things you can't have." She closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. It kept returning to the same questions, circling them like a dog worrying a bone. Why did he help me? What does he want? What will happen when morning comes and the town starts talking? And beneath those questions, darker and more dangerous, how long before someone recognizes my name? How long before the past catches up with me? The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, washing away the tracks of the wagon and the footprints in the mud. By morning there would be no evidence that Lenora Ashby had ever walked through the streets of Millbrook. But evidence had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. She woke to the gray light of dawn and the smell of coffee drifting up from below. For a moment, Lenora didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, the bed was wrong, the sounds were all wrong. No clattering of other boarders in the hallway, no Mrs. Grimsby's shrill voice calling everyone to breakfast. Just birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of old wood settling in the morning chill. Then memory returned, and with it a complicated mixture of relief and dread. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now stiff and uncomfortable from their soaking the night before, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was warm, the wood stove already crackling with a fresh fire, and Silas stood at the counter with his back to her, slicing bread with methodical precision. "Good morning," Lenora said, and he turned. In the daylight she could see him clearly for the first time. He was handsome in a weathered, careworn way, tree-deep-set eyes the color of autumn leaves, hands that spoke of years of hard work. But it was the sadness that struck her most, the quiet grief that seemed to have settled permanently into the lines of his face. "Miss Ashby?" He nodded toward the table. "Sit. Coffee's ready." She sat, wrapping her hands around the cup he placed in front of her, savoring the warmth. "Where are the children?" "Rosie's still sleeping." Ezra's in the barn doing his chores. He paused, his knife hovering over the bread. "He's not happy about you being here. I want you to know that." "I gathered as much." "He's protective of his sister, of this family. He's had to grow up fast these past 2 years." Silas set down the knife and turned to face her fully. His mother died when Rosie was 5. Fever took her in the winter of 75. Ezra was 10 years old, and he watched her. He stopped, swallowed hard. He watched her go. It changed him. "I'm sorry," Lenora said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose someone." Something flickered in Silas's eyes, recognition perhaps, or curiosity. But he didn't ask, and she was grateful for it. "I meant what I said last night," she continued. "I want to earn my keep. I can cook, clean, help with the children, whatever you need." Silas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "There's a woman in town," he said, "Mrs. Pemberton. She's been helping with the children since Mary died, coming by a few times a week to cook and clean. But she's getting on in years, and the walk from town is hard on her, especially in winter." He paused. "If you're willing to take over her duties, I can offer you room and board, plus a small wage. It won't be much, but—" "Yes," Lenora said before he could finish. "Yes, I'm willing." The relief that crossed his face was almost painful to witness. "Good. That's good." He turned back to the bread, resuming his slicing with renewed focus. "I should warn you, though. People in town will talk. A young woman living under the same roof as a widower, they'll make assumptions." "Let them," Lenora said with more confidence than she felt. "I've survived worse than gossip." Silas glanced at her over his shoulder, and for just a moment she saw something sharpen in his gaze, a question he was too polite to ask, an observation he was filing away for later. "He's not a fool," she realized. "He knows I'm running from something." But whatever his suspicions, he kept them to himself. He simply nodded and said, "Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes. I'll call the children." He walked out the kitchen door, leaving Lenora alone with her coffee and her secrets. She stared down at her reflection in the dark liquid, distorted and unrecognizable. "This could work," she told herself. A quiet farm, a grieving family, a town too small to attract attention. I could disappear here. I could finally be safe. But even as she thought it, she heard the echo of Mrs. Grimsby's words. "The past has a way of finding us, Miss Ashby, no matter how far we run." And somewhere, miles away in St. Louis, a man with cold eyes and a long memory was opening a letter that would change everything. A letter that mentioned a woman matching Lenora Ashby's description. A woman who was supposed to be dead. The morning arrived with a cruelty that only October could muster. Gray light seeping through lace curtains like water through cracks in a dam, slow and inexorable. Lenora woke disoriented, her body stiff from the unfamiliar softness of the feather mattress, her mind taking several long seconds to piece together where she was and why. Margaret Callahan's room, Margaret Callahan's bed. She sat up too quickly and the room tilted. When had she last eaten properly? 2 days ago? 3? The bread and cheese Silas had left outside her door the night before sat untouched on the nightstand, her appetite having fled in the face of exhaustion and anxiety. Now, however, her stomach made its demands known with an undignified growl. Lenora dressed quickly in her second dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better years, and attempted to smooth her hair into something presentable using the small hand mirror she'd packed. The face that stared back at her looked hollow-cheeked and pale, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them, a habit from her mother's teachings that felt foolish now, but comforting in its familiarity. The farmhouse was quiet as she descended the narrow staircase, her hand trailing along the worn wooden banister. Morning light revealed details she'd missed in last night's darkness. A watercolor painting of wildflowers hanging crooked on the wall, a child's wooden toy soldier abandoned on a step, dust motes dancing in shafts of pale sunshine. She found the kitchen empty but warm, the cast-iron stove radiating heat from a fire someone had already stoked. A pot of coffee sat on the back burner, and beside it, a note in blocky handwriting. "Miss Ashby, gone to the north pasture, back by noon. Coffee is fresh. Eggs in the basket. S." Callahan. Lenora read the note twice, touched by its simple consideration. She poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that trembled only slightly and stood at the window, watching the rain-washed world beyond the glass. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scrubbed clean and glittering with moisture. Rolling fields stretched toward a line of trees in the distance, and she could see a barn, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be a small vegetable garden gone to autumn seed. It was peaceful, deceptively so. "You're in Mama's kitchen." Lenora spun, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup and burning her fingers. She hadn't heard anyone approach, yet there stood a girl in the doorway. The same girl from last night, though Lenora hadn't gotten a proper look at her then. In daylight, she could see that Josephine Callahan was small for what must be 8 years, with wheat-colored hair pulled back in a severe braid and eyes the color of storm clouds. Those eyes were fixed on Lenora with an intensity that made her feel like a butterfly pinned to a collector's board. "Good morning," Lenora said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "You must be Josephine." I know who you are." The girl didn't move from the doorway. "Papa told us. You're the woman from town who had nowhere to go." There was something in the way she said it, "nowhere to go," that made Lenora's cheeks flush with shame. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "That's right. Your father was very kind to offer me shelter. Papa's kind to everyone, Josephine's chin lifted. That's why people take advantage of him. The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Lenora found herself at a loss. She had expected wariness from the children, had prepared herself for it even, but there was something in this girl's gaze that went beyond simple suspicion. This was assessment, calculation. The look of someone who had learned too young that the world was full of people who would disappoint you if you let them. I don't intend to take advantage of anyone, Lenora said quietly. I mean to earn my keep here, if your father will allow it. Doing what? Whatever needs doing. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I can cook. Josephine crossed her arms over her narrow chest. I've been cooking for months now. And Ezra helps with the cleaning, and Mrs. Patterson from church comes by to do the mending when she has time. I see. So we don't need you. The words landed like stones, each one precisely aimed. Lenora felt something twist in her chest, not anger exactly, but a deep recognition. She knew this girl. Not personally, of course, but she knew this type of girl, because she had been one herself once. A child forced to grow up too fast, building walls of competence and hostility to hide the terrified, grieving heart underneath. Perhaps not, Lenora agreed. But I'm here now, and I'd like to help if I can, even if it's just for a little while. Josephine's eyes narrowed. How long is a little while? I don't know yet. That's not an answer. No, Lenora admitted. It isn't. But it's the truth. I've learned that making promises about the future is a dangerous business. Things have a way of changing. Something flickered across the girl's face. Surprise, perhaps, at being spoken to honestly rather than placated with comfortable lies. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same cool assessment. Mama used to say that too, Josephine said, and her voice caught slightly on the word mama. That the only thing certain in life is uncertainty. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. The words were fierce, protective. She was the best mother in the whole world, and no one can ever replace her. Lenora felt the weight of the statement settle over her shoulders like a yoke. I wouldn't dream of trying. Good. Josephine finally moved from the doorway, stalking past Lenora to the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these motions hundreds of times. She pulled a cast-iron skillet from its hook and set it on the burner with more force than necessary. Ezra likes his eggs scrambled soft, she announced, as if daring Lenora to contradict her. And Papa takes his fried with the yolks runny. I make mine however I want because I'm the one cooking them. Would you like help? No. Lenora watched as the girl cracked eggs into a bowl with surprising skill, whisking them with quick, efficient strokes. There was something almost hypnotic about her movements, the way she added a splash of milk without measuring, the way she tested the heat of the pan with a practiced hand hovering just above the surface. You're very good at that, Lenora observed. Josephine's shoulders tensed. I told you, I've been doing it for months. Since your mother passed? The whisking stopped. Josephine stood frozen, her back to Lenora, and for a long moment the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the stove. Mama got sick in the spring, she said finally, her voice stripped of its earlier hostility. She couldn't get out of bed most days. So I learned to cook so Papa wouldn't have to worry about us while he was taking care of her and the farm. Ezra tried to help, but he's only 5. He burns things. That was very brave of you. It wasn't brave. Josephine poured the eggs into the heated skillet with a sizzle. It was just what needed doing. Lenora thought of her own mother, wasting away in that cramped apartment in St. Louis, coughing blood into handkerchiefs while Lenora worked double shifts at the textile mill to pay for medicine that never worked. She thought of the choices she'd made in desperation, the lines she'd crossed, the woman she'd become in the shadow of that grief. It was just what needed doing. Sometimes, Lenora said softly, the things that need doing are the bravest things of all. Josephine said nothing, but her movements slowed slightly, some of the rigid tension easing from her spine. The kitchen door banged open, and a small boy burst through like a cannonball, all wild, dark curls and dirt-smudged cheeks. He skidded to a halt when he saw Lenora, his eyes going wide. "You're the Rain Lady!" he exclaimed. "Josie, look! The Rain Lady's still here!" "I can see that, Ezra." Josephine didn't turn from her cooking. "Go wash your hands. Breakfast is almost ready." "But Josie—" "Now, Ezra." The boy, Ezra, shot Lenora a gap-toothed grin before scampering off toward what she presumed was a washroom. His sister watched him go with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and fierce, protective love. "He's too trusting," Josephine said almost to herself. "He thinks everyone is good because he doesn't remember when they weren't." "And you remember?" The girl finally turned to face her, and in her storm-gray eyes Lenora saw something that made her heart ache. The weight of memories too heavy for such young shoulders, the burden of being the one who remembered while everyone else tried to forget. "I remember everything," Josephine said. "That's why I watch. That's why I wait. Because people always show you who they really are eventually. You just have to pay attention." She turned back to her eggs, leaving Lenora standing in the middle of the warm kitchen, feeling more exposed than she had in months. People always show you who they really are eventually. If that was true, and Lenora suspected it was, then she was in more danger than she'd realized, because the person she really was, the things she'd done, the secrets she carried, if this sharp-eyed child ever discovered the truth, there would be no shelter, no safety, no quiet disappearance into the rhythms of farm life. There would only be consequences. And somewhere in the back of her mind she heard again the echo of Mrs. Grimsby's warning, felt again the cold certainty that had settled into her bones the moment she'd fled St. Louis with nothing but a stolen name and a desperate prayer. The past has a way of finding us. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats announced Silas's return from the north pasture. But Lenora barely heard them. She was too busy watching Josephine Callahan's narrow back, too busy wondering how long she had before this child, this fierce, grieving, impossibly perceptive child, saw through all her carefully constructed lies. And what would happen when she did? That evening, as Lenora helped clear the supper dishes despite Josephine's pointed silence, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A newspaper, folded on the corner of Silas's desk in the parlor, 3 days old from the look of it, and on the front page, partially visible above the fold, a headline that seemed to pulse with terrible significance. "St. Louis businessman offers reward for information on missing woman." Beneath it, blurred but unmistakable, was a sketch that looked far too much like her own face staring back. The newspaper seemed to burn through the wood of Silas's desk, radiating heat that only Lenora could feel. She stood frozen, a chipped dinner plate still clutched in her trembling hands, her reflection ghosting across its glazed surface like an accusation. St. Louis. The word alone was enough to send ice cascading through her veins, crystallizing the fragile peace she had begun to construct in this farmhouse. She had been so careful, had traveled so far, had changed trains 3 times, paid in cash, spoken to no one who might remember her face. And yet here it was, her past, folded neatly on a widower's desk in rural Pennsylvania, waiting to devour everything. "Miss Ashby?" Josephine's voice cut through the fog of Lenora's panic. The girl stood in the kitchen doorway, her small arms crossed, her expression caught somewhere between suspicion and something that might have been concern. "You've gone pale as milk," Josephine observed. "Are you going to faint? Because I don't know how to catch a grown woman, and Papa's still in the barn." Lenora forced herself to breathe, to move, to set the plate down on the sideboard with hands that shook only slightly. "I'm quite well," she managed.
"Just tired. The storm. I haven't fully recovered." Josephine's eyes narrowed, unconvinced, but she said nothing more. She simply collected the remaining dishes and retreated to the kitchen, her small footsteps deliberately heavy on the wooden floor. Alone again, Lenora allowed herself one more glance at the newspaper. The sketch was crude, a rough approximation based on a photograph she knew had been taken at her engagement party, back when she had been foolish enough to believe in promises. The artist had softened her jaw, widened her eyes, made her look younger and more innocent than she had felt in years. But it was close enough that anyone paying attention might pause, might wonder, might write a letter to St. Louis and collect whatever reward Frederick Ashby was offering for information about his missing fiancée. No, she corrected herself bitterly, his missing property. The back door creaked, and Lenora heard the heavy tread of boots being stamped clean on the mat. Silas's voice drifted through the house, low and warm as he spoke to someone outside. "Told you, Sam, I don't need charity. The children and I are managing." Managing? The second voice was rougher, edged with skepticism and something that sounded like long-suffering affection. "Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's been sleeping in the barn and calling it a choice." Lenora retreated from the parlor, positioning herself near the kitchen doorway where she could observe without being immediately seen. Josephine had gone quiet, her hands stilled over the wash basin, her attention fixed on the back door with an expression of wary recognition. Silas entered first, his broad shoulders filling the frame before he stepped aside to reveal his companion. Samuel Drummond was perhaps a decade older than Silas, with a weathered face that spoke of hard years and harder choices. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and deep lines bracketed a mouth that seemed more accustomed to frowning than smiling. But his eyes, sharp and assessing, held an intelligence that made Lenora's stomach clench with renewed anxiety. This was not a man who missed details.
"Uncle Sam!"
Ezra's voice rang out from somewhere upstairs, followed by the thunder of small feet on the staircase.
The boy launched himself at the older man with an enthusiasm Lenora hadn't yet seen from him, and Samuel caught him easily, swinging him up with a grunt of exertion.
"Getting too big for this, boy,"
Samuel said, but there was warmth beneath the gruffness.
"What have you been eating? Rocks?" "Josie's been cooking," Ezra reported solemnly. "It's not as good as Mama's, but we don't tell her that."
"Ezra!"
Josephine's outraged cry echoed from the kitchen, and Samuel laughed, a rough, unexpected sound that transformed his severe face into something almost gentle. "Honest as his father," Samuel observed, setting the boy down and ruffling his hair. "That'll serve you well. or get you killed, depending on the day. It was then that his gaze found Lenora. She watched the warmth drain from his expression, replaced by something careful and calculating. He didn't move, didn't speak, simply studied her with the patient attention of a man who had learned to read people the way others read books. "Silas," Samuel said slowly, not looking away from Lenora, "you want to tell me why there's a strange woman standing in your kitchen?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication.
Lenora felt Josephine's gaze on her as well now, and even Ezra had gone still, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Silas cleared his throat. "Sam, this is Miss Lenora Ashby. She's helping with the children, temporarily." Helping. Samuel repeated the word as though testing it for hidden meanings. And where did this help come from exactly? "I found her in town," Silas said, and something in his voice had hardened, a quiet warning that Lenora recognized as protective. "During the storm. She needed shelter, and I needed—" He trailed off, and in the silence, Lenora heard everything he couldn't say. "I needed someone. Anyone. I'm drowning and I can't admit it, and this stranger showed up at exactly the moment I was ready to go under." Samuel's expression didn't soften. "A word, Silas. Outside." It wasn't a request. Silas hesitated, his gaze finding Lenora's across the room. She saw the apology in his eyes, the uncertainty, and something else, something that looked almost like shame at having his judgment questioned in front of her. "Children," he said quietly. "Help Miss Ashby finish the dishes."
"I'll be back shortly." The door closed behind the two men, and Lenora was left in a kitchen that suddenly felt very small, with two children who watched her as though waiting for her to prove their uncle right. Through the window above the wash basin, Lenora could see the two men standing near the barn. Samuel's posture was aggressive, his hands cutting through the air as he spoke. Silas stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, absorbing whatever his brother was saying with the patience of a man who had heard it all before. "Uncle Sam doesn't like strangers," Ezra offered, appearing at Lenora's elbow with a dish towel. "He says people can't be trusted until they prove otherwise." "Your uncle sounds like a wise man," Lenora said carefully. "He's not our real uncle," Josephine added from across the kitchen. Her voice was matter-of-fact, stripped of its usual hostility. "He was Papa's sergeant in the war. They saved each other's lives, Papa says, so that makes them brothers." Lenora absorbed this information, watching as Samuel jabbed a finger toward the house, toward her. "They seem close." "Uncle Sam moved here after Mama died." Josephine's hands had stilled on the pot she was scrubbing. "He has a farm about 2 miles east. He comes by every few days to check on things, on us." To make sure no one takes advantage, Lenora thought, hearing the echo of Josephine's earlier accusation. The girl had learned her suspicions from somewhere, and now Lenora knew the source. The back door opened and both men entered. Samuel's expression had settled into something cold and watchful, while Silas looked tired, more tired than Lenora had yet seen him, as though the conversation had drained whatever reserves he had been hoarding. "Miss Ashby," Samuel's voice was formal, clipped. "My brother tells me you've agreed to help with the household, temporarily." "That's correct, Mr. Drummond." "And where did you come from, before Millbrook?" The question was casual, almost friendly, but Lenora recognized the trap beneath it. This man had survived a war. He knew how to interrogate, how to find the cracks in a story and pry them open. "I was working at a textile factory," she said,
choosing her words with care.
In Pittsburgh.
The position ended, and I was seeking new employment when I found myself between circumstances. Between circumstances. Samuel's lips twitched, not quite a smile. That's a delicate way of putting it. And before Pittsburgh? Sam, Silas's voice carried a warning. I'm just asking questions, Silas. The kind any sensible man would ask before letting a stranger sleep under his roof, under the same roof as his children. The words hit their mark. Lenora saw Silas flinch, saw the doubt flicker across his face before he suppressed it, and she understood with terrible clarity that Samuel Drummond had just planted a seed that would grow whether she wanted it to or not. I have nothing to hide, Mr. Drummond, she said, and the lie tasted like ash on her tongue. I'm simply a woman who fell on hard times. Your brother was kind enough to offer me shelter when no one else would. I intend to repay that kindness through honest work, and then I'll be on my way. Samuel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned to Silas. I'll be back in 3 days. We'll talk more then. He left without another word, and the kitchen felt larger in his absence, emptier somehow, despite the 4 people still standing in it. That night Lenora couldn't sleep. She lay in Margaret Callahan's bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around her. The newspaper was still downstairs, still waiting, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and crept down the stairs with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to move without being heard. The parlor was dark, but enough moonlight filtered through the windows to illuminate Silas's desk. The newspaper was gone. Lenora's heart stuttered. She searched the desk's surface, checked the drawers, looked in the waste bin. Nothing. Looking for something? She spun, her hand flying to her throat. Silas stood in the doorway to the kitchen, a cup of something steaming in his hands. His expression was unreadable in the dim light. I couldn't sleep, she managed. I thought I might find something to read. At 2 in the morning? It wasn't a question. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. The newspaper, Silas interrupted quietly. The one that was on my desk. You saw it at supper. I watched your face change when you noticed it. Lenora's blood turned to ice. Silas set his cup down and moved closer, his footsteps deliberate on the wooden floor. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I burned it in the stove after Sam left. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the grief that never quite left his expression. I don't know who you're running from, Miss Ashby, and right now I don't need to know. But I want you to understand something. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Even in the darkness, Lenora recognized it. The sketch from the newspaper, carefully torn free before the rest was destroyed. I'm keeping this, Silas said. Not to threaten you, but because if you're going to stay in my home with my children, I need to know that you won't disappear in the middle of the night without a word. I need to know that whatever trouble is following you won't land on their doorstep. Lenora's throat was too tight to speak. So here's what I'm offering. Silas's voice was steady, certain, the voice of a man who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. You stay. You help with the children, with the house, and when you're ready, when you trust me enough, you tell me the truth. All of it. He held her gaze in the moonlit darkness. And then we'll figure out what to do together. The paper disappeared back into his pocket, and Silas turned away, retrieving his cup and moving toward the stairs. He paused at the bottom step, not looking back. "Sam will dig, Miss Ashby. It's what he does. He'll write letters, ask questions, follow every thread until he finds what he's looking for." A pause. "You have until he finds something to decide whether you want me on your side when he does." He climbed the stairs, leaving Lenora alone in the darkness with the weight of an impossible choice. Outside, a rider passed on the main road, unusual for this hour, this far from town. The hoofbeats faded into the night, but not before Lenora caught a glimpse through the window. A man on horseback, pausing at the end of the Callahan Drive, looking toward the house, and then, slowly, riding on. The rider did not return that night, but his shadow lingered in Lenora's mind like a stain that would not wash clean. She barely slept, lying rigid beneath Margaret Callahan's quilts, listening to every creak of the old farmhouse settling, every whisper of wind against the windows. Each sound became hoofbeats. Each shift of moonlight through the curtains became a figure at the glass. When dawn finally bled gray through the eastern sky, Lenora rose with gritty eyes and a heart that had not stopped racing since she'd seen that silhouette pause at the end of the drive. She found Ezra in the kitchen. The boy sat at the table in the thin morning light, his small hands wrapped around something she couldn't see. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence at all, but neither did he flee. It was, she supposed, a kind of progress. "Good morning, Ezra," she said softly, moving toward the stove to check if any embers remained from the previous night's fire. He said nothing. But when she glanced back, she found him watching her with those solemn gray eyes, his father's eyes, she realized now, tracking her movements with the wary attention of a creature deciding whether to bolt or stay. She busied herself with coaxing the fire back to life, giving him space, letting the silence stretch without trying to fill it. The kindling caught, the flames grew. She set water to boil for coffee, the familiar motions grounding her, pulling her back from the edge of panic that had been her constant companion since discovering that newspaper. A small sound made her turn. Ezra had risen from his chair and crossed the kitchen without making a noise, a skill she thought that children in uncertain homes often developed. He stood beside her now, close enough to touch but not quite touching, and in his outstretched hand lay a small object, a feather, blue-gray, slightly bent, probably from a jay. Lenora's throat tightened. She crouched down slowly, bringing herself to his level, and accepted the offering with both hands as though it were something precious. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful." Ezra's face remained solemn, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been relief or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that she had understood the language he spoke. "Did you find this outside?" she asked. A small nod. "Do you collect them? Feathers?" Another nod, slightly more emphatic this time. Then, before she could ask anything else, he turned and padded out of the kitchen on bare feet, disappearing into the house's morning shadows. Lenora stayed crouched for a long moment, the feather resting in her palm like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Silas came in from the barn an hour later, bringing with him the smell of hay and animals and cold morning air. He paused in the doorway when he saw her at the stove, something complicated passing across his weathered features. "You didn't have to," he began. "I wanted to," Lenora said, and it was true. The work steadied her. The simple tasks of cooking and cleaning gave her hands something to do besides tremble. Ezra gave me a feather this morning." Silas's expression softened with a grief so familiar it had worn grooves into his face. "He does that." Margaret used to say he was building a nest, collecting things to make the world feel safer. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. He doesn't give them to just anyone. Before Lenora could respond, the sound of hooves on the drive made them both freeze. Silas moved to the window, his body suddenly tense, one hand reaching unconsciously toward the rifle that hung above the door. Lenora's heart hammered against her ribs. The rider from last night, had he returned? Had Frederick sent someone already, traced her somehow to this remote farm in the Pennsylvania hills? "It's Samuel," Silas said, and she heard the relief in his voice even as he tried to mask it. "Again." The word "again" carried weight, warning. Samuel Drummond dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle and approached the house with purpose in his stride. Silas met him on the porch, and though Lenora couldn't hear their words through the closed door, she could read the tension in both men's postures, Samuel's aggressive, questioning, Silas's defensive, weary. She should hide. She should retreat to the room upstairs and make herself invisible until whatever storm was brewing had passed. But something kept her rooted in place, some stubborn refusal to cower that had gotten her into trouble before and would likely do so again. The door opened. Both men entered. Samuel's eyes found her immediately, sharp and assessing. "Miss Ashby," he said, and the name struck her like a physical blow. "That is your name, isn't it? Lenora Ashby?" The kitchen seemed to contract around her. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt her hands go cold against the fabric of her borrowed dress. "Samuel," Silas began. "I rode into town this morning," Samuel continued, his voice hard as flint. "Stopped by the general store. Interesting thing, there's a notice posted. A reward notice for information about a missing woman." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, holding it up so they could all see the sketch printed on its surface. "Dark hair, green eyes. Last seen in St. Louis, believed to be traveling east." The sketch was crude but recognizable. Lenora stared at her own face, rendered in newsprint ink, and felt the walls closing in. $25, Samuel said. "That's what they're offering for information. $25 is a lot of money for folks around here." "How long do you think it'll take before someone else notices the resemblance?" "That's enough." Silas stepped between them, his voice carrying an authority Lenora hadn't heard from him before. "Whatever you think you know, I think I know that you've taken a stranger into your home, a stranger with secrets, a stranger who has men looking for her." Samuel's weathered face was flushed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. Fear for his friend, Lenora realized. Fear for the children. "I think I know that you're not thinking clearly, Silas. You haven't been thinking clearly since Margaret." "Don't." The single word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare use her name to—" "Someone has to say it. You're lonely. You're grieving, and this woman appears out of nowhere, out of a storm. And suddenly you're taking her in, giving her Margaret's room, letting her near your children. She helped Rosie. She found Rosie alone in the rain and brought her back to me. And that's convenient, isn't it?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Almost too convenient." Lenora found her voice at last, though it came out thin and strange. "I didn't plan any of this. I didn't know who she was."
"I didn't know." Then tell me who you are. Samuel turned on her, his gaze boring into hers. Tell me the truth, all of it, because if you can't, then I'm going to assume the worst, and I'm going to do whatever I have to do to protect this family. The silence stretched taut as wire. Lenora looked at Silas, saw the question in his eyes, the same question Samuel was asking, but gentler. Who are you? What are you running from? Can I trust you with my children, my home, my heart? She thought of Ezra's feather, still tucked in her apron pocket. She thought of Josephine's fierce grief, her desperate need to protect a father who didn't know how to protect himself. She thought of Rosie, crying in the rain, lost and afraid. She thought of Frederick Ashby, with his cold eyes and his possessive hands and his absolute certainty that she belonged to him. "My name is Lenora Ashby," she said, "and yes, I'm the woman in that notice. I ran from a man who believes he owns me, a man who will not stop looking, a man who will destroy anyone who stands between him and what he considers his property." She met Samuel's gaze without flinching. "I didn't ask to come here. I didn't plan any of this. But I am not a danger to this family. I am the danger that has followed me to their door." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Samuel's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalculating. "This man, the one looking for you, what is he to you?" "My father's business partner. He arranged our engagement before my father died, and the arrangement was not what I was led to believe." The words tasted like ash. "When I tried to end it, he made it clear that my consent was not required. So you ran." "So I ran." Another silence. Then Samuel turned to Silas, something complicated passing between the two old friends. "You knew?" "I suspected." Silas's voice was quiet but steady. "I saw the paper. I saw her face. And I made a choice. A choice that could bring trouble to your door, to your children. My children lost their mother 8 months ago. They've already had more trouble than any child should bear." Silas straightened his shoulders. "I won't turn away a woman in need because of what might happen. That's not who Margaret raised me to be." Samuel let out a long breath, running a hand over his weathered face. For a moment he looked every one of his years, tired and worried and caught between loyalty to his friend and fear of what that loyalty might cost. "There was a man in town last night," he said finally, "asking questions at the inn. Well-dressed, Eastern accent. Said he was looking for a woman who might have passed through recently." Lenora's blood turned to ice. "He's gone now. Rode out early this morning, heading toward Millbrook. But he'll be back." Samuel fixed her with a hard stare. "Men like that always come back." The sound of small footsteps made them all turn. Ezra stood in the doorway, his carved wooden horse clutched against his chest, his gray eyes wide and frightened. He had heard everything, or enough of it to understand that something was wrong. Without a word, he crossed the kitchen and pressed himself against Lenora's side, one small hand fisting in the fabric of her skirt. Samuel watched the gesture, and something in his face finally cracked. "Well," he said heavily, "I suppose that settles it." Before anyone could respond, Rosie's voice rang out from the front of the house, high and excited. "Papa!"
"Papa, there's a man coming up the drive." And through the kitchen window, Lenora saw a figure on horseback approaching the farm. Not the rider from last night, but someone else.
Someone wearing the unmistakable uniform of a county sheriff. The kitchen fell silent, save for the ticking of the mantel clock in the parlor, each second stretching into an eternity. Lenora felt the blood drain from her face as she watched the sheriff's horse pick its way up the muddy drive, the man's badge glinting dully in the gray morning light. Ezra's hand tightened in her skirt. "Silas!" Samuel's voice had lost its accusatory edge, replaced by something more urgent. "You expecting the law?" "No." Silas moved to the window, his broad shoulders blocking Lenora's view. She was grateful for that small mercy, grateful not to watch her doom approach. "Sheriff Brennan doesn't ride out this way unless there's trouble." Trouble. The word echoed in Lenora's mind. Frederick had found her. He must have. The notice in the newspaper, the rider last night, it had all been leading to this moment.
She thought of the room upstairs, Margaret Callahan's room with its yellow wallpaper and cross-stitched sampler, and felt a sudden, piercing grief for the brief sanctuary she had found within its walls. "I should go," she whispered, though her legs felt rooted to the floorboards. "I should—" "You should stay exactly where you are." Silas turned from the window, and the look in his eyes stopped her words in her throat. It was not the gentle kindness she had grown accustomed to seeing there, nor the exhausted grief that shadowed his features when he thought no one was watching. This was something harder, something protective. "Whatever this is about, running will only make it worse." "But you don't understand." Miss Ashby, Samuel's use of her full name made her flinch. But when she met his gaze, she found no malice there, only a weary sort of resignation. "My late wife's maiden name was Ashby. Her family came from Missouri, good people, most of them. I recognized the name when Silas mentioned you yesterday. And I'll admit I let my suspicions get the better of me." Lenora stared at him, uncomprehending. "I sent a telegram last night," Samuel continued, his weathered hands twisting his hat brim, "to my wife's cousin in St. Louis. Asked him what he knew about a young woman named Lenora Ashby who might have reason to leave town in a hurry." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "You?" The reply came this morning. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I rode out here to tell Silas what I'd learned. But it seems the sheriff had the same idea about paying a visit." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats ceased. A horse snickered. Rosie's excited chatter drifted through the walls, and Lenora heard Josephine's sharper voice telling her sister to hush. "What did the telegram say?" Silas asked quietly. Samuel unfolded the paper, but he didn't read from it. Instead, he looked directly at Lenora, and for the first time, she saw something like sympathy in his craggy features. It said that Frederick Ashby is a man of considerable wealth and even more considerable cruelty, that his first wife died under circumstances the authorities chose not to investigate too closely, that his second engagement ended when the young lady in question threw herself from a bridge rather than face the altar. He paused, letting the words settle like stones in still water. And that his third intended bride disappeared 2 months ago, leaving behind everything she owned except the clothes on her back. Lenora's throat constricted. She had not known about the bridge. Dear God, she had not known. A heavy knock sounded at the front door.
"Papa!"
Rosie's voice rang out again.
"The sheriff wants to talk to you."
Silas held Lenora's gaze for a long moment. Whatever he saw there seemed to decide something for him, because he nodded once, a small, firm gesture that felt like a promise. "Samuel, take Miss Ashby upstairs. The back stairs, through the pantry."
"Silas,"
Samuel began. "Please."
The word was quiet but unyielding. "I'll handle Brennan." Lenora wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that she wouldn't hide behind a good man's reputation while he lied to the law on her behalf. But Ezra was still pressed against her side, his small body trembling, and she thought of Josephine's fierce protectiveness and Rosie's innocent trust, and she understood that this was not only about her anymore. She had let herself become part of something, a household, a family, however temporarily, and families protected each other. "Come on, then." Samuel's hand closed around her elbow, surprisingly gentle. "Quietly now." The back stairs were narrow and dark, hidden behind a door in the pantry that Lenora had not noticed before. She climbed them with her heart hammering against her ribs, Samuel's bulk a reassuring presence behind her. At the top, a short hallway led to what appeared to be a storage room filled with old furniture and dust-shrouded trunks. "Wait here," Samuel murmured. "Don't make a sound." He disappeared back down the stairs, and Lenora was left alone with the ghosts of the Callahan family's past. A rocking horse with a cracked runner, a cradle that must have held Rosie as an infant, stacks of books and linens that Margaret had likely meant to sort through someday. Someday. How many women had their someday stolen from them by men who believed ownership was the same as love? Through the floorboards, she could hear the muffled rumble of voices, Silas's measured baritone, the sheriff's gruffer tones. She pressed her ear to the floor, straining to make out words. "Reports of a woman matching a certain description," the sheriff was saying. "Come through town about a week ago. Reverend Whitfield mentioned he'd heard you'd taken on some help." "My children needed looking after." Silas's voice was calm, unhurried. "I hired a housekeeper, hardly a matter for the law." "Nobody's saying it is. But this woman, she's wanted for theft, Mr. Callahan. Stole a considerable sum from her employer before she ran. The man's offering a reward for information leading to her return." Lenora's blood turned to ice. Theft! Frederick had accused her of theft. Of course he had. It was elegant in its simplicity, a crime that would turn public sympathy against her, that would give him legal grounds to drag her back. "What did she supposedly steal?" Samuel's voice now, casual and curious. "Jewelry. Family heirlooms, according to the gentleman who filed the complaint."
Worth several $1,000s. "And this gentleman, he have a name?" A pause. "Frederick Ashby, from St. Louis. Says the woman was his fiancée, that she took the items from his home before disappearing." "His fiancée?" Samuel's tone dripped with skepticism. "Seems an odd thing, filing theft charges against a woman you intended to marry." "I don't make the laws, Mr. Drummond. I just enforce them." The sheriff's voice hardened slightly. "Now, Mr. Callahan, I'd like to speak with this housekeeper of yours, just to rule her out, you understand." The silence that followed was terrible. Lenora pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sound of her own ragged breathing. She should go down. She should face this. She should not let Silas Callahan sacrifice his reputation, his standing in this community for a woman he barely knew. But her body would not move.
"I'm afraid that won't be possible, Sheriff." Silas's voice drifted up through the floorboards, steady as bedrock. "Miss Ashby left this morning. Said she had family in Ohio she needed to see. I paid her wages and wished her well." "Left this morning?" The sheriff's tone was flat with disbelief.
"In this weather?" "She was anxious to be on her way. I offered to drive her to the station myself, but she insisted on walking, said she preferred it." Another pause, longer this time.
Lenora could picture the sheriff's eyes scanning the kitchen, taking in the signs of recent habitation, the second coffee cup on the counter, perhaps, or the women's shawl she had left draped over a chair. "Mind if I take a look around?" "I do, actually." Silas's voice had acquired an edge. "This is my home, Sheriff Brennan. My children's home. Unless you have a warrant, I'll thank you to respect that." "Now, Silas." "The man's within his rights," Samuel again, his voice carrying the weight of decades of community respect. "And I'll tell you something else, Tom Brennan. I've known Frederick Ashby's type my whole life. Men who use the law as a weapon against women who dare to refuse them. If this young lady did take something from that man's house, I'd wager my farm she had good reason. That's not for us to decide. No, it's for a judge and jury, if it comes to that. But it won't come to that today, will it?"
"Because the woman you're looking for isn't here." The floorboards creaked as someone shifted weight. When the sheriff spoke again, his voice was resigned. "I'll need to file a report. Say I came out here and found nothing." "You do that." Silas's tone softened slightly. "And, Tom, if you find yourself inclined to send any telegrams to St. Louis, I'd ask you to reconsider. For the sake of whatever woman this Ashby fellow is hunting, she might not be the thief he claims." A long, weighted silence, then footsteps moving toward the door. "I'll be in touch," the sheriff said, "if anything changes." The door opened and closed. Hoofbeats retreated down the drive, and Lenora sat in the dusty storage room, surrounded by the remnants of a dead woman's life, and wept silently into her hands. She did not hear the footsteps on the back stairs until Josephine was already standing in the doorway, her small face pale but resolute. "He's gone," the girl said quietly. "Papa sent me to fetch you." Lenora wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "Josephine, I heard what they said." The child's voice was steady, too steady for her years. "About the man who's looking for you." "About what he claims you did. I didn't steal anything, I swear to you."
"I know."
Josephine crossed the room and knelt beside her, and for the first time, her eyes held no suspicion, no hostility, only a fierce, burning certainty. "My mama used to say you could tell a person's character by how they treated those who couldn't fight back. You've been nothing but kind to Rosie and Ezra. To me, even when I was horrible to you. You weren't horrible. You were protecting your family."
"Yes."
Josephine's jaw tightened.
"And now we're going to protect you."
Before Lenora could respond, the girl pulled something from her apron pocket, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age.
"I found this in Mama's things," Josephine said, "after she died. I never showed Papa because I didn't understand what it meant. But I think—"
She hesitated, then pressed the paper into Lenora's hands.
"I think maybe you will."
Lenora unfolded the paper with numb fingers. It was a letter, written in an elegant feminine hand, dated 3 years earlier.
"My dearest Margaret," it began.
"I write to warn you of a man who may soon arrive in your town, seeking a fresh hunting ground." And at the bottom, a signature that made Lenora's heart stop in her chest. "Your loving friend, Catherine Ashby." Frederick's first wife. The woman who had died under circumstances no one had investigated. The woman who had, it seemed, known exactly what her husband was, and had tried to warn others before he silenced her forever.
The letter trembled in Lenora's hands as she read Catherine Ashby's words again, each line a revelation that cut deeper than the last. My dearest Margaret, I write to warn you of a man who may soon arrive in your town, seeking a fresh hunting ground. My husband, Frederick Ashby, presents himself as a gentleman of means and impeccable character. He is neither. What he is, I cannot fully commit to paper, for fear this letter should fall into wrong hands. But I implore you, if you hear of any young woman, particularly one without family or protection, who has caught his attention, warn her. Warn her as I wish someone had warned me. I have made arrangements. Should anything happen to me, certain documents will find their way to those who might use them.
I pray it will be enough. Your loving friend, Catherine Ashby. The paper was yellowed at the edges, soft from handling. Margaret Callahan had read this letter many times, Lenora realized, had kept it hidden in this storage room, among forgotten things, where it might survive whatever came. She knew, Lenora whispered into the darkness. She knew, and he killed her anyway. The floorboards creaked somewhere below. Lenora pressed herself against the wall, clutching the letter to her chest, straining to hear voices through the wooden beams. Sheriff Brennan's bass rumble, Silas's measured responses. Words she couldn't quite make out, though she caught her own name once, twice, Ashby, and felt each utterance like a physical blow. Time stretched and warped in that cramped space. Minutes became hours, or perhaps only seconds. Lenora couldn't tell. She found herself studying Catherine's handwriting, the careful loops and elegant slant of a woman who had been raised to ornament a wealthy man's home. A woman who had discovered too late what monster she had married. I have made arrangements. What arrangements? What documents? And had they survived her death, or had Frederick found and destroyed them along with everything else? The voices below fell silent. Lenora held her breath. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate. Not Silas's familiar tread, not Samuel's older, more careful gait. She pressed back into the corner behind a stack of crates, making herself as small as possible. The storage room door had no lock. If Sheriff Brennan decided to search. The footsteps passed by, continued down the hall, paused, then retreated, growing fainter, descending the stairs once more. Lenora released a shaky breath. More voices, the front door opening and closing, the jingle of a horse's bridle, the creak of a saddle. Silence. She waited, counting her heartbeats, until finally, she heard Silas's voice calling softly up the stairs. Lenora, it's safe now. She emerged into the hallway on unsteady legs, Catherine's letter still clutched in her hand. Silas met her at the top of the stairs, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp, searching her expression. What did he want? Lenora asked. Looking for a runaway from back east. Said there was a reward being offered. Silas's jaw tightened. A substantial one. And I told him I hadn't seen any strangers matching the description. He paused, studying her face, which was true enough. The woman they're looking for is described as timid, frightened, easily manipulated. I told him the only new person I'd encountered lately was a capable woman helping with my children. Didn't seem to match what he was after. Despite everything, Lenora felt the ghost of a smile tug at her lips. You lied to the sheriff. I told him what I observed. Silas's expression remained carefully neutral. A man's entitled to his own observations. Samuel appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his weathered face grim.
He's gone for now, but he'll be back. The reward's too good, and Brennan's got 3 children of his own to feed. He'll start asking around town, showing that sketch to folks. Then we need to move quickly, a new voice said. Lenora turned, startled, to find Josephine standing in the doorway of her bedroom. The girl's expression was fierce, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. Josephine, Silas began. I heard everything, the girl interrupted. Through the walls.
I know about the bad man who's looking for Miss Lenora. I know what he did to those other ladies. Her voice wavered slightly, but she lifted her chin. And I know Mama kept that letter for a reason. Silas went very still. What letter? Lenora held up the yellowed paper.
I found it in the storage room. It's from Catherine Ashby, Frederick's first wife. She was friends with your Margaret, it seems. She tried to warn her about him. Silas took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. His eyes moved across the familiar handwriting, and Lenora watched something shift in his expression. Grief giving way to understanding, and understanding to cold, quiet fury. Margaret never told me, he said softly. She never... He broke off, pressing his fingers to his eyes. She was protecting you, Samuel said, same as she was protecting anyone else who might cross that man's path. Margaret Callahan was never one to burden others with troubles she thought she could handle alone. But she couldn't handle it alone, Josephine said fiercely. She needed help, and she didn't ask for it, and now... The girl's voice cracked. Now Miss Lenora needs help, and we have to give it. We have to, Papa.
Mama would want us to. The room fell silent. Lenora looked at this child, this fierce, grieving, impossibly brave child, and felt something crack open in her chest. For weeks, Josephine had treated her with suspicion and hostility, had guarded her father and brother against the intrusion of a stranger, and now, when it mattered most, she had chosen to fight. There's someone in town, Samuel said slowly. Someone who might be able to help. Dorothea Phelps's dry goods store sat at the corner of Main Street and Carpenter's Lane, its windows displaying bolts of fabric and practical household items. The bell above the door chimed as Samuel entered, Lenora following close behind with her head down and her shawl pulled forward to shadow her face. The store smelled of cedar and lavender, of new cotton and old wood. A boy of perhaps 16 looked up from where he was stacking boxes behind the counter, his expression shifting from welcome to wariness as he took in the strangers. Help you folks? We're here to see your mother, Samuel said. Tell her it's Sam Drummond, and it's urgent. The boy, Thomas, Lenora remembered from Samuel's briefing, disappeared through a curtained doorway. Voices murmured in the back room. A moment later, the curtain parted, and Dorothea Phelps emerged. She was a handsome woman in her middle years, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze swept over Samuel, lingered on Lenora, and narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Samuel Drummond," she said. "It's been some time." "It has, Dottie. I wish I was here for pleasanter reasons." "I suspect you hear about the young woman Sheriff Brennan was asking after this morning." Dorothea's attention fixed on Lenora with uncomfortable intensity. "He showed me a sketch. Said there was a wealthy gentleman from back east offering $500 for information about his missing fiancée." Lenora's heart sank. $500. More money than most people in Bitter Creek would see in years. Enough to tempt even the most principled soul. The sketch wasn't a very good likeness, Dorothea continued, still watching Lenora. I told the sheriff I hadn't seen anyone matching the description. Hope flickered, fragile and uncertain. But that doesn't mean I won't change my mind. Dorothea folded her arms across her chest.
I've built my reputation in this town on honest dealing. I don't harbor criminals or runaways without good reason. So I suggest you give me one, Mr. Drummond. A good reason why I shouldn't march straight to the sheriff's office and collect that reward myself. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded telegram. This came for me yesterday from a contact in St. Louis, a lawyer named Harrison who's been investigating Frederick Ashby's affairs for the past 2 years. Dorothea took the telegram, her eyes scanning the cramped text. As she read, Lenora watched her expression change, skepticism giving way to something harder, colder. It says that Catherine Ashby didn't die of a fever, as the official record claims. It says that a maid in the household saw bruises on her mistress's body in the weeks before her death. It says that the second woman to be engaged to Frederick Ashby threw herself from a bridge rather than marry him, and that her family received a substantial payment to keep quiet about the circumstances. Samuel's voice was low, urgent.
And it says that this lawyer has been building a case against Ashby for years, waiting for someone, anyone, to come forward with testimony that might finally bring him to justice. Dorothea looked up from the telegram, her gaze finding Lenora's. You were engaged to this man? Yes. Lenora forced herself to meet that penetrating stare. I didn't know what he was, not at first. He was charming, attentive, everything a woman without family or fortune might dream of. By the time I understood the truth, I was trapped. How did you escape? I ran. 2 months ago, in the middle of the night. I've been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of the men he sends to find me. Lenora's voice shook, but she pressed on. I know how this looks. A strange woman arriving in town with no references, no family, nothing but the clothes on her back. I know you have no reason to trust me. You're right, Dorothea said flatly. I don't. The words hit like a blow. Lenora felt her last hope crumbling. But I trusted Margaret Callahan, Dorothea continued. Trusted her judgment, her character, her heart. And if Samuel Drummond tells me that Margaret kept a letter warning about this man for years, kept it hidden and safe against the day it might be needed. She paused, something softening almost imperceptibly in her stern features. Then I'm inclined to think Margaret saw something in this situation that's worth protecting. There's more, Samuel said. The lawyer, Harrison, he's willing to come here, to take Lenora's testimony and add it to his case. But he needs time, a week, maybe 2, to make the journey and prepare the legal documents. A week? Dorothea's lips pressed into a thin line. Sheriff Brennan will have turned this town inside out by then. Not if the town doesn't cooperate. The dry goods store fell silent. Dorothea Phelps looked from Samuel to Lenora, her expression unreadable. You're asking me to lie to the sheriff. I'm asking you to protect an innocent woman from a murderer, Samuel said quietly. The same way Margaret Callahan would have done, if she'd lived long enough to see this day. Dorothea was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to her son, who had been listening from behind the counter with wide eyes. Thomas? Close up the store. Ma? Do as I say. She untied her apron, folding it with precise movements. And then go fetch Pastor Williams,
Dr. Harmon and Clara Jessup from the boarding house. Tell them Dorothea Phelps requests their presence on a matter of urgent community concern." Thomas scrambled to obey. Dorothea turned back to Lenora, and for the first time something like warmth flickered in her eyes. "If we're going to hide you from a wealthy man with enough money to buy half the county," she said, "we're going to need more than just the Callahan farm. We're going to need the whole damn town." The meeting convened in the back room of the dry goods store as evening fell. Lenora sat in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Dorothea Phelps laid out the situation with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Pastor Williams, a gentle-faced man with kind eyes, listened with growing horror. Dr. Harmon, gruff and practical, asked pointed questions about the evidence. Clara Jessup, the same Clara who ran the boarding house where Lenora had briefly stayed before moving to the Callahan farm, sat rigid with outrage. $500, Clara spat. "Blood money, that's what it is, and Brennan's fool enough to chase it." "Brennan's not a fool," Dorothea corrected. "He's a man with a family and not enough salary to feed them. That's what makes this dangerous. He'll do his job, and his job is to find this woman and deliver her to whoever's paying." "Then we don't let him find her," Pastor Williams said quietly. "We tell him we haven't seen her, all of us, speaking with one voice." "That's conspiracy," Dr. Harmon pointed out. "If it comes out. If it comes out that we handed an innocent woman over to a murderer, I'll never sleep again," Clara interrupted. "I've got enough sins on my conscience without adding that one." The discussion continued. Logistics, alibis, plans within plans. Lenora listened, overwhelmed, as these strangers, these people who owed her nothing, debated how best to protect her from a man who had destroyed everything she'd ever loved. And then the door burst open, and Thomas Phelps stumbled in, his face white with fear. "Ma! Sheriff Brennan! He's coming up the street, and there's a fancy carriage with him." "A carriage?" Dorothea rose sharply. "What kind of carriage?" "Black, with gold trim." "And there's a man inside, Ma. A man in a fine coat asking about—" Thomas's eyes found Lenora. "Asking about her." The blood drained from Lenora's face. Frederick. Frederick was here. The world narrowed to a single point of terror. Frederick was here. In this town. On this street. Coming for her. Lenora's legs gave way, and she would have collapsed had Samuel not caught her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was both firm and surprisingly gentle. "Easy now," he murmured. "We're not beaten yet." "You don't understand." Her voice came out as a whisper, thin and reedy. "He'll never stop. He'll never." "Lenora." Silas's voice cut through her panic, steady as bedrock. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Look at me. I need you to breathe." She tried, failed, tried again. "That's it. Just breathe." "He killed Catherine," she gasped. "He'll kill me too. He will do nothing to you." Silas's jaw was set like granite. "Not in my town. Not while I draw breath." Dorothea was already moving, pulling Lenora toward the back of the shop. "The root cellar." "Thomas, move those crates." "No." Everyone froze at the sound of Lenora's voice. It surprised even her, the sudden steel in it, forged in the furnace of her terror. "No more hiding." She straightened, though her hands still trembled. "If I run now, I run forever, and he wins." "This isn't about winning," Samuel said sharply. "This is about survival." "Is it?" Lenora thought of Catherine's letter, still folded in her pocket.
of Margaret Callahan, who had kept that letter for years, waiting for the right moment to use it. Of all the women who had suffered at Frederick's hands while the world looked away. Or is it about finally making him answer for what he's done? The front door of the dress shop rattled. "Mrs. Phelps!" Sheriff Brennan's voice boomed through the wood. "Open up! I've got a gentleman here with a legal claim." "A legal claim on a human being," Dorothea muttered, her face flushed with righteous anger. "As if we were still trading in souls." "The back door," Thomas urged. "Please, miss." But Lenora was already moving toward the front of the shop, her spine straight, her chin lifted. She had spent 2 months running. She had spent her entire engagement cowering, placating, trying to make herself small enough to survive Frederick's rages. No more. Silas caught her arm. "Lenora, wait." "I have to face him." She turned to look at him, this man who had offered her shelter without questions, who had defended her to his suspicious friend, who had hidden her from the law at risk to himself and his children. "But I don't have to face him alone. Will you stand with me?" Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like pride. "Always," he said simply. Samuel muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a curse, then moved to flank her other side. Dorothea positioned herself at the counter, arms crossed, the very picture of maternal indignation. Lenora opened the door. Frederick Ashby stood on the wooden boardwalk, immaculate in his charcoal traveling coat, his dark hair perfectly pomaded, his handsome face arranged in an expression of wounded concern. Behind him, Sheriff Brennan shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about his role in this drama. "Lenora." Frederick's voice was honeyed, gentle, the voice he used when there were witnesses. "My darling. Thank God you're safe." He stepped forward, arms outstretched as if to embrace her. Lenora did not flinch, did not retreat. "Stay where you are, Mr. Ashby." Frederick's mask flickered just for an instant, revealing the cold rage beneath. Then the concerned fiancé was back, brow furrowed with confusion. "Darling, you're not well. The strain of your father's debts, the pressure of the wedding preparations, it's clearly affected your mind. Come home with me. We'll find you the best doctors." "The way you found doctors for Catherine?" The words landed like stones in still water. Frederick went very still. "I beg your pardon?" "Your first wife." Lenora's voice was steady now, fed by a current of righteous fury she hadn't known she possessed. "The one who died of a sudden illness 3 months after your wedding. The one who wrote to her friends warning them about you before she died." Sheriff Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Now, miss, that's a serious accusation." "I have her letter." Lenora pulled the folded paper from her pocket. "Written in her own hand, witnessed and dated. She knew what you were, Frederick. She knew, and she tried to warn others." Frederick's composure cracked further. "That letter is a forgery, a fabrication created by a hysterical woman." "Then you won't mind if Sheriff Brennan reads it?" Lenora extended the letter toward the lawman. "Along with the testimony I'm prepared to give about your behavior during our engagement. The threats, the violence, the way you told me exactly what would happen if I ever tried to leave you." "She's lying." Frederick's voice had lost its honey. "She's a disturbed woman who fled her legal obligations. I have every right to collect what belongs to me." "I am not property." The words rang out clear and strong.
I am not a debt to be collected, and I am not afraid of you anymore." Frederick lunged. He was fast, faster than she'd expected, but Silas was faster. The farmer stepped between them, catching Frederick's wrist and twisting it with the casual strength of a man who wrestled livestock for a living. "You'll want to step back, Mr. Ashby. This is none of your concern." Frederick's face had gone ugly, all pretense of civility abandoned. "She's my fiancée, my property under law." "There is no law that makes a woman property." Samuel's voice was ice. "Not anymore."
Not in this country. The engagement contract can be dissolved. Dorothea stepped forward, her eyes blazing.
"Especially when one party can demonstrate that the other concealed material facts, such as, for instance, the suspicious deaths of previous wives and fiancées."
Frederick went pale. "You can't prove, can't we?" Samuel pulled a telegram from his coat pocket.
"I've been busy this morning, Mr. Ashby. Sent some inquiries to St. Louis, to Boston, to the town where your first wife grew up." He unfolded the paper. "Fascinating how many people remember Catherine Ashby. How many of them always suspected something wasn't right about her death. This is slander. I'll have you in court." "Please do." Samuel's smile was wolfish. "I'd welcome the opportunity to present this evidence before a judge, along with the letter, along with Miss Lenora's testimony, along with the testimony of your household staff, several of whom, I'm told, are quite eager to unburden their consciences." The color drained from Frederick's face entirely. Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat. "Mr.
Ashby, perhaps we should discuss this matter at my office." "There's nothing to discuss." Frederick's voice had gone shrill. "This is a conspiracy, a plot against me by—"
"By whom?"
Lenora stepped forward, and for the first time in their acquaintance she saw fear in Frederick's eyes.
"By the women you've terrorized? By the people who finally decided to believe them?"
Frederick looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the moment he realized he had lost.
The moment he understood that his money, his connections, his careful reputation could not save him from the truth. "This isn't over," he snarled.
"Yes,"
Lenora said quietly.
"It is."
Frederick turned and strode toward his carriage, his movements jerky with barely suppressed rage. Sheriff Brennan followed, speaking in low, urgent tones about questions that need answering and statements to be taken. The black carriage with its gold trim rattled away down the muddy street. Lenora watched it go and felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been wound tight for months, for years, perhaps for her entire life. She swayed. Silas caught her. "I've got you," he murmured, and she believed him. The Callahan farmhouse was warm with lamplight and the smell of bread baking, Josephine's doing, Lenora had learned, one of the simple meals the girl had mastered in her mother's absence. 3 weeks had passed since Frederick's carriage had disappeared down Main Street. 3 weeks of statements and testimonies, of telegrams flying between towns, of a scandal that had rocked St. Louis society to its foundations. Frederick Ashby had been arrested on suspicion of murder. Catherine's body was being exhumed. Witnesses were coming forward, one after another, their silence finally broken. Lenora sat by the fire, a cup of tea warming her hands, watching Ezra, Samuel, she reminded herself, though everyone called him Ezra to avoid confusion with Samuel Drummond, carefully arrange his collection of feathers on the hearthrug. He had given her 3 more since that first blue-gray one,
each presented with the same solemn silence, the same grave trust. "You're staying, aren't you?" Lenora looked up to find Josephine standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes fixed on Lenora's face with their usual intensity. Lenora hesitated. "I don't know."
I haven't.
Papa wants you to stay.
Josephine crossed her arms, but her voice lacked its earlier hostility.
He smiles more when you're here. He didn't used to smile at all.
Josephine.
I'm not saying I like it.
The girl's chin jutted out stubbornly.
I'm just saying, if you were going to leave, you should do it now, before Ezra gets more attached.
A pause.
Before I get more attached.
Lenora's heart clenched.
Come here, she said softly.
Josephine hesitated, then crossed the room with the careful dignity of a child trying very hard to seem older than her years. She stopped just out of arm's reach.
I'm not trying to replace your mother, Lenora said. No one could ever replace her. She was clearly a remarkable woman. She was. Josephine's voice wobbled slightly. She taught me to read, and to cook, and to take care of things. And you've done beautifully. But Josephine, Lenora reached out, slowly giving the girl time to pull away. When she didn't, Lenora took her hand. Taking care of things doesn't have to mean doing it all alone. It's all right to let people help. It's all right to just be a child sometimes.
Josephine's lower lip trembled. For a moment she looked exactly her age, 8 years old, grieving, exhausted from carrying burdens no child should bear. Then she was in Lenora's arms, crying softly against her shoulder, and Ezra had abandoned his feathers to press against them both, and Silas was standing in the doorway with an expression that made Lenora's breath catch. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as a housekeeper, not as help with the children. Stay as—" He stopped, swallowed. "Stay as family, if you'll have us." Lenora looked at him over his children's heads, at this man who had offered her shelter without questions, who had believed her without proof, who had stood between her and her monster without hesitation.
"Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay."
Outside, the October rain had finally stopped. Through the window, Lenora could see the first stars emerging, bright and steady against the darkening sky. She was home.